Hello, must readers. I'm Erin Popelka. I curate must read fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. And I am so delighted to be here today with author Michael Nye. Michael, thank you so very much for being with us.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. A little bit about Michael Nye. He is the author of two books, a collection of short stories called Strategies Against Extinction, and the forthcoming the forthcoming novel, All the Castles Burned, which is due out in February 2018. He was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, and attended Ohio State University and got his Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. So I'm so excited to speak with you today, Michael Nye. Thank you. So let's just start with this novel that's coming out next month. Tell me about All the Castles Burned.
Sure. So, as you said, it's a second book, but debut novel, and it's a first-person story about Owen Webb, who's a teenage boy who gets accepted to an elite private school, and he falls under the sway of a boy named Carson Bly, who's an upperclassman. He comes from a wealthy family, and he curates kind of a mysterious persona that really captivates Owen. At the same time, Owen's parents, their marriage is falling apart. The secrets that his father has been keeping from the family finally come to a head and explode about halfway through the book, um, essentially ruining the family. So it's a book about male friendship, about violence, anger in boys, about basketball, about first loves, about family, a whole range of things. And a lot of the book has a semi-autobiographical strain to it. And this was, let's see, attempt number 4 on a novel. So hopefully that's enough to get us going on a couple of questions that you might have about it.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, indeed. Well, certainly attempt number 4 on a novel, but book number 2, I for one have definitely had my attempts at novels for sure. So there's a process to these things, and I feel like
Mhm.
you learn something with each one and each attempt, and so very exciting that this it will be your debut novel. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, I remember when I was in graduate school, I tried writing a novel under the influence of Charles Baxter. He wrote this novel called First Light. Have you ever read this?
I have not read that one, no.
It's a mosaic in terms of its structure, but it essentially goes chronologically backwards. And I remember thinking, oh, that's really cool. So I tried writing my thesis as a novel that went backwards. And any novelist will tell you a book that chronologically goes backwards has no narrative momentum. So it was a interesting failure on my part. And there have been a couple other attempts in between, but that's probably the biggest. Oh yeah, a book does have to go forward lesson that I learned.
Sure, sure. Well, certainly tension. Tension helps to like go from
Tension
the
help.
start to
There's
the
a reason to
end.
keep reading. Yeah.
Yes, yes, indeed. So I want to take a moment. You talked about how basketball kind of plays into All the Castles Burned. And so tell me about, the decision to have sports be a part of the novel.
Yeah, it's one that I came back to when I was first starting to learn how to write in undergraduate when I was at Ohio State. I would occasionally write a little bit about sports. I think kind of stereotypically, white boy from the suburbs in the '90s. Sports. That's the things that you read, John Tunis novels and Sports Illustrated and so forth. And then in graduate school, I tried getting away from that. I didn't want to feel constrained by writing about sports and thinking of myself as a sports writer or a guy that could only write about athletics. And so the next couple of writing projects, whether it was a short story or those failed novels, I really tried to avoid writing sports.
Mm.
And I ended up coming back to it because I really like writing about the body, athleticism, and having action. And feeling that I could write about sports in a way that was a little bit different than what I might see in a major magazine or on a website. And as for why basketball, it's really something that can be a strength for a writer when thinking about writing about sports. I think you look back at the 20th century for American literature, a lot of baseball, a lot of boxing. The great thing about basketball is that you can have your character by his or herself, shooting free throws, dribbling. You don't need other people around, but then you can also have your character interacting with uh, everybody else, whether it's in a game, a practice, a scrimmage. Basketball really gives you, as a writer, a lot of flexibility for creating those kind of action scenes. So it's something that I really enjoyed writing and tried to write those those action sequences a little bit differently than I'd seen other books do.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And there's something, so my athletic background is I was a swimmer. And so there's definitely something about athleticism and about that journey and that struggle, because so much of it is individual. But you're right, there's also a big team aspect for it too, that, we're moving forward, we're making progress through our bodies, but also interacting with people in that as well. So are you also an athlete?
I don't know if I call myself an athlete. I play a lot of basketball, or at least I used to. My wife and I recently moved back to Ohio Labor Day weekend, and 6 days later, I broke my leg playing basketball.
Oh, my
Uh,
word.
yeah, so I currently have permanent titanium in my tibia. I broke it in two places right below the knee. So I think it was, let's see, medial and lateral tibia plateau fractures is what I had.
Oh, I'm
So
sorry.
yeah, me too. And so I have been non-weight bearing for about 3 months, and I'm just getting back to being able to walk. They say the recovery time is 9 months to a year.
Oh,
So
wow.
I'm actually speaking to you from what will be kind of a writing desk, and I'm able to stand right now. I've got one of those variable desks that can go up and down.
Sure.
But right now, I'm mostly writing from a chair again, like the good old days when I was 35. So yeah, I do love playing basketball. It's a big part of my life. This is my second serious injury. I tore my Achilles 6 years ago, I think, something like that. And you would think that would teach me to retire, but it really hasn't. I hope to be able to play again by the spring.
Understood. And have you found that the discipline of, kind of having basketball in your life and having athletics kind of as a part of your life, how has that affected your writing practice?
Yeah, I think having something physical to do gives you a place where you don't think about the writing for a while. You don't think about what you're reading. Playing pickup basketball is one of the only times where I really feel that my mind is clear. I think a lot of your viewers are going to remember how all throughout 2017 and probably for the next 3 or 4 years, you have a hard time concentrating. You're constantly looking at the news,
Mhm.
Facebook, Twitter, trying to keep up on what's going on, fearing that you're missing out on something. Athletics really does give you some discipline. There's a lot of writers that will talk about how important it is for him or her to go on a daily run or long walks, something to just kind of clear your mind and get the heart going. So I think athletics and writing really do go hand in hand. I mean, particularly with being an athlete like yourself, you know that you have to practice technique as a swimmer. You do a lot of things over and over and over again. You don't just get to race meets. Same thing with writing. You practice your sentences, you practice words, you practice how you divvy up your paragraphs. It's a very similar type of discipline, just one's of the mind, the other's of the body.
Absolutely. And that same repetition too, in that, it's a lot of time alone at the desk, working on things, and you don't know where they're going to go. You don't know if you're going to be faster at that meet. You don't know if you're going to beat the other team, but
Yeah.
you have to put in that time and you have to create that space to get better. And whatever the outcome is whatever the outcome is.
Yeah, and I think it's like writing, it's something that you get better at. I know when I was a teenager, I just wanted to play games, whether it was pickup or whether it was for the school. I didn't really enjoy practice. And as I got older and no longer mattered whether or not I was any good at basketball, I found that I like practicing things more. And I think writing has become the same way. There's a lot of anxiety around publication. I think all of us feel that way, making sure that we find a readership, that people care about our words. But at the same time, I kind of like practicing, working on a story over and over again. I like doing revision. I like drafts. I like rethinking a problem that I've created for myself, whether it's character, language, or action, whatever it might be. I like that feeling of reworking it until it's right. So yeah, I think they definitely go hand in hand.
hmm And now, in terms of that idea of reworking it until it's right, was there a point in All the Castles Burn that you found you're like, you had to just keep working? There was something that was like, it wasn't quite right and you had to keep playing with it? Were there moments in that novel that you really had to work for?
Yeah, for I think two separate reasons. First, one of the strains in the novel is autobiographical. So Owen's father is based on my own father. For people that haven't had a chance to read the book yet, without spoiling too much, Owen's father has a double life. My father was the same way. He was the blueprint for this book. And I've been writing about my father from that very first undergraduate writing workshop. So I've been telling that story for 20 years in a range of different ways. So, you always are trying to work out your past, who your parents were, who you are by definition. So I guess in some ways I was driven to do that with the book. The second thing is just that process of revision, knowing that you're not getting it right. I think anybody that's gone through a writing program and sticks with it learns to become his own best critic. And knowing that you want to make sure that you're getting the book right, you want to get the story right. And that process of finding your stumbling blocks and figuring out what's not working and what isn't, why you have to go back and do it again. Sometimes you can articulate it, sometimes you can't. When I was first finished this book, and I think I was probably done with it a little prematurely, it was a little bit different in terms of what it was exploring and how it divided time. And I got a lot of enthusiastic responses from agents who would look at the first chapter or first 50 pages, be like, yes, let me see this, send this to me. And then they'd be like, nah, I'm not very interested.
Mm.
And after you hear that a couple of times, it's like, the second half of this book just isn't working. There's something about it that needs to be redone. So, yeah, those two things, that kind of internal drive for that story that you're always kind of telling. And then second, the response from my reader and writer friends from the publishing world told me that I needed to do a little bit more work.
Excellent. Well, certainly all of that work paid off. Congratulations that the novel is coming out next month. So exciting.
Thanks.
And your story is also really interesting because you've also spent some time on the other side of the desk working as an editor. So can you speak to me a little bit more about that experience of, not just being a writer, but also being an editor as well?
Yeah, of course. So when I was a graduate student getting my MFA, I started working on a literary journal called Natural Bridge. And I primarily took the class because everybody else in my cohort took the class, and we thought the class was great. You get to read stories and then you publish them. That's fun. And after that, I ended up working at River Styx, an independent journal based out of St. Louis, first as a fiction editor and then the managing editor. And the fiction editor, of course, he just kind of makes suggestions to the editor in chief and hope they get published. The managing editor has a much different role at a magazine, writing grants, dealing with correspondence, trying to find a readership, printers, dealing with the mail, a whole range of things where you're trying to find an audience for a magazine that's always struggling to find an audience. And after doing that for 5 years, I switched to being the managing editor at the Missouri Review, which was a much larger organization than River Styx, but kind of the same mission, which is to find the best new writing first and bring it to an audience. And it had a teaching component, so I got to direct an internship. I got to teach a creative writing class on campus. It was really fascinating. It was a lot of fun. I loved doing it. So now I'm an associate editor with Boulevard Magazine, kind of taking a step back, again, looking for fiction to publish, helping to put together our symposium, a couple of other things with social media and finding a readership, but primarily, taking a backseat and helping out. And I guess the big takeaway that I found from all those years of working on publishing is that you need to tell a story that's compelling. You really want to engage a reader. I read a lot of stories that are dead on arrival on page one, and I hate admitting that, but it really is true. Stories that ultimately get published are compelling to a reader right away. And it's not so much a subject matter, it's a quality of having to tell your story, right? It's just some of its voice, style, swagger, I don't know what you would call it, but there's more than one way to skin a cat, pardon the cliche,
Sure.
to telling a really great story. And after years and years, I've read probably thousands of short stories from writers just like you and me. Getting a sense of what's going to get a piece going forward, what's going to interest me as a reader, has really helped shape my development as a writer as well.
Absolutely. Yes. And it is that tricky thing because sometimes, certainly, there are things that can be revised for about a story. I know that if I'm working on a story and I'm like, I know there's something here and it's
Yeah.
not quite there. And sometimes I have to get clear for myself, like, oh, what is the story I'm trying to tell? Where am I going? What needs to be there? And then that's
Mhm.
reflected back on the first page. And sometimes it's more like, oh, no, I really need to do just like a pass for cliches and cut them all out and go from there.
Yeah, and I don't like doing first drafts. That's the thing that I dislike the most because I can refine the story that I'm telling, knowing where it's ultimately going. So getting out of that first draft stage is really important to me. I'm struggling on a first draft right now, and it drives me crazy. And I want to rush through it, I guess, because I don't really know what I want to emphasize or focus on in the story if I don't know where it's going. And
Mhm.
sometimes you get submissions to a magazine, and you feel like the writer's never figured that out his or herself either. I think a lot of the stories that are, pretty good but not quite there, really focus a lot on what the writer is exploring, a lot of that self-expression that I think writing begins from. But it's not communicating. It's not really thinking hard about who's the person on the other end that's reading this story. Even when you get to that point, it's not so much a general readership. You tend to think of a very specific person that would be reading your work. Kind of the ideal reader who at the same time is very skeptical of the story you're telling. It's kind of a weird state of mind that you have to get into to get from a really good draft to a publishable draft.
Absolutely. Yes. And fun and exciting and very exciting to be on the other side of the table to see all of those variations through many different writers as it passes. And when you get that one across your desk and you're like, "Oh yeah, this one's it." What a zing. Like it's everyone you hope that it'll be that, but it's definitely a zing when you find it.
Yeah, definitely. I can remember the stories that I was really enthused about right away. I can also remember the ones that ultimately didn't get published that I loved. At no time in my publishing career have I been the sole decider about what gets in the magazine. It always is a collaboration. At the Missouri Review, there was a couple of people, but there was primarily three of us that made a decision on what fiction went into the magazine, and you could never quite tell what all three of us would agree on. So there has to be a certain quality of hang on tightly, let go lightly when it comes to sending a story that you really like to the editor in chief. You just don't know. And sometimes, reading the story again, a couple days later, I find that I don't love it as much as I did on that first rush. I might find some things in it that are a little bit weaker, sins that I forgave because it's the best thing I'd read in 100 submissions. And of course, the flip can happen as well, where it's like, oh, I like this even more than I thought I did. And I can remember some of those disappointments, the stories that didn't get published by the Missouri Review that ended up in the Atlantic or Colorado Review or Plowshares. I mean, the generous part of me thinks great work always finds a home, even if it's not in my magazine. The petty part of myself is really mad that we missed on those stories and they ended up somewhere else, but that's just part of the gig. So
Sure, sure, absolutely. So I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about the Midwest. So All the Castles Burned is set in Ohio, where you
mhm.
currently live. And I have also lived in Ohio, and I have also
Yeah.
lived in St. Louis. And so we have actually some very strange Midwestern connections. It's delightful. So talk to me about the Midwest and what is it about the Midwest that informs your writing, and how do you think about it as a setting?
Yeah, it's funny. I had a hard time writing about Ohio when I lived there. Right after college, I moved to Boston, and then I could write a little bit more about Ohio. And I was setting my stories, and this was 15 years ago, setting them more in Ohio, in the Midwest in general, but not having a real refined sense of the difference between, say, a Cincinnati and a St. Louis yet. And then after I went to graduate school, I started setting a lot of my stories in Boston because I no longer lived there. And then once I moved from St. Louis to Columbia, which for those of you unfamiliar, they're about 100 miles apart in Missouri, I started setting more stories in St. Louis. And I began writing All the Castles Burned, which is set in Cincinnati, when I was living in Columbia, Missouri, which is about, I don't know, 600 miles, 800 miles. They're far apart. So why the Midwest? It has that sense of place that I feel really seeps into your bones. Um, the people in the Midwest, I mean, we make jokes about how we're really friendly, we're really nice, we're really polite, but there's an undercurrent to that, where that politeness comes from, where that sense of manners comes from, what things might be hiding underneath it. Um, Lots of wide open spaces and a lot of wonderful cities like Chicago or St. Louis, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, but also those great big flat Midwestern plains if you're driving through Illinois or Indiana, which those are just brutal drives.
Mhm.
They really seep into my character, the way that I think about how my sentences work, what my characters are like. and the type of characters that are not going to externalize a lot of their thoughts and feelings, which I think is makes for really terrific tension and scene. Um, and Cincinnati is a place that changes every time I go back. My mother and sister still live there, and when you go back to a city, once a year, you become more aware of how much things can change, how one neighborhood that was vibrant suddenly isn't, or vice versa. Um, and that sense of having a richer history, a city that goes back 200 years that has been disregarded and forgotten about by the media. God, I sound like I'm running for office. Is actually really vibrant, and there's a huge range. I mean, Ohio doesn't encompass anything really distinct. I mean, Cleveland, Columbus, Marietta, Cincinnati, Toledo, Youngstown—they're all very different places. Ohio is just a way to start easing into what those differences might be. And so for me, for Cincinnati, it's a city that I've always thought of very fondly. That I've always really loved. It's a city of hills. It's a German town. I think it's a working class town. I mean, like any city, there's a lot of there's people that are wealthy that have money, but it's a place with goatees and wraparound shades and a lot of pickup trucks. It's a place where soccer is one of the most popular sports. Grader's Ice Cream, Skyline, the importance of Procter and Gamble, working at the same place for a long time, and struggling when that kind of sense of city and community has begun to vanish. So, I mean, I could go on. I'm probably rambling at this point, but it's just I think my sense of love of place is really coming through. I hope this, you know, frequently detouring answer about why Cincinnati is the ideal place for this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on a couple things that are really rich in terms of certainly both kind of the Midwestern polite, right? Because being polite is that these are the rules of engagement, right? This is how we
Yeah,
interact with each other so that we don't have to look at the scary underbelly and the things that maybe we don't want to be as forthcoming about, which I think is something that's absolutely at play in All the Castles Burned in terms of like the face that is shown versus what's actually happening underneath, which is definitely there. And I think that's true with like all of Ohio, because for people who don't know it, it's really easy to be like, oh, it's just one of those Midwestern states that you forget about, with all the cities that start with C, there's not a lot of differentiation there. Have you never been there, right? But living
yeah.
there is, like, there is a lot more to the four seasons, like that they have very distinct spring, summer, fall, winter, that there is just sort of like a depth to the experience that maybe isn't flashy. It's not New York City, but there's like a richness to that comes from living there as well.
Yeah, and if you look at her, probably the most popular writer of the last 2 or 3 years, right? Celeste Ng is from Cleveland. A great novelist, Tiffany McDaniel, published her debut a couple of years ago, set here in Ohio. The variety of the type of writing you can find here is incredibly rich, and those characters that we're talking about, that sense of having manners, having politeness, but also what it hides, doesn't necessarily have to be evil or rich, but it gives you a sense of history. Why does that character behave that way? Where does that sense of the proper way to behave at a dinner table come from? And I've also found that from going out to restaurants in Cincinnati, the kind of jokes that the waiters and waitresses tell is also very different. Jokes about, oh, that was a silly thing for him to say. I could have smacked him in the back of the head. And I'm like, you don't say that. Like, you don't joke about something like that, except you kind of do in Cincinnati. It's just a very different culture that I think is rich in its diversity, and fun for exploring in fiction. It's something that I was really happy to try to get to when writing this book.
Wonderful. And so the book comes out in February. So how are you celebrating? Like, is it sort of you're holding your breath now till the book comes out? What are the next steps to bringing it into the world?
Well, I recently read an article, I don't remember where, it might have been LitHub, might have been Electric Literature, about how to prepare for publication day. And most of the writers said it's going to be a deafening silence. Oprah is not showing up on my doorstep, right? The news truck is not coming to my door, right? I think like most writers, you frantically check your Amazon ranking to see how many books have sold. Um, but what I'm doing is I'm driving down from Columbus, where I live now. My wife and I are going down to Cincinnati. I'm doing a reading at Joseph Beth, which is an independent bookstore in Cincinnati. My mom will be in attendance, so I have to pick a section that doesn't have too much profanity. It's going to be really fun to see who comes out. We've gotten some nice press coverage in Cincinnati to do a reading at a bookstore I've been going to for a very long time, possibly see some old friends. I mean, that's going to be really terrific. And then, honestly, I kind of want to get back to the new novel. I mean, we've got some book promotion to do. I've done some interviews, written some essays that we hope to place. I've got readings scheduled in February, March, and April. You know, all in cities where I get to see some old friends. So that's a blast. But I kind of want to get back to writing. It's been hard to focus on this new novel when I'm constantly thinking about promoting a book. They're two very different skill sets, and I don't have any idea how authors are good at balancing the two. I find that I'm kind of all in on one and then all in on the other. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure it's going to be wonderful on that first day. At the same time, I feel like all the hard work's done. You know, the book's been written and finished for months now. It's gone through the copy editing process. I've seen the proofs. It looks lovely. But yet it also feels kind of done. It's kind of a peculiar feeling, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, good luck navigating that. And I hope that you get time to work on this next novel. Are you talking about it? I asked that very delicately. There's no wrong answer.
I'm going to stay with the old writer's tradition of saying next to nothing about the new book.
Sure.
The only thing that I would add is that I don't want to write the same novel again. I thought that was an interesting comment. I forget where I saw the interview that Ishiguro gave after his Nobel Prize. Maybe it was an interview from beforehand, where his goal was to always write a completely different book each time. So that's what I'm trying to focus on, writing a different book this time, set in the Midwest, I will tell you that. But other than that, it's hopefully going to be a completely different book.
Oh, fantastic. Well, hopefully we can talk to you then when novel number 2 comes out. In the meantime, must readers, please do check out Michael Nye's book, All the Castles Burned, or his short story collection, Strategies Against Extinction. And Michael Nye, thank you so very much for speaking with me today.
My pleasure, and this was a lot of fun.